she mocked the Vampire King's wife for her looks. Then the Queen appeared in a royal red gown and left everyone speechless. The grand ballroom of the Crimson Palace had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light dancing off walls draped in midnight velvet and gold. Tonight marked the 500th anniversary of the Vampire King's reign, and nobles from every corner of the Eternal Kingdom had gathered to pay their respects. Among the crowd stood Lady Vivienne Ashford, a vampire noblewoman whose beauty was legendary throughout the realm. Her porcelain skin seemed to glow in the candlelight, her raven hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of silk, and her emerald eyes sparkled with an intelligence that had captivated countless admirers over her 3 centuries of existence. Vivienne stood at the center of a circle of admirers, her crystal glass of blood wine held delicately between her fingers. She wore a gown of deep purple that hugged her curves perfectly, imported from the finest tailors in the eastern provinces. Everything about her screamed refinement, beauty, and power. "Have you seen her yet?" whispered Lady Caroline, one of Vivienne's closest companions, leaning in conspiratorially. "The Queen, I mean." Vivienne's lips curved into a subtle smirk. "No, and honestly, I'm not in any rush. From what I've heard, she's hardly worth the anticipation." The group around her fell silent, exchanging nervous glances. It was one thing to gossip about the Queen in private, but quite another to do so openly at a royal function. Lord Marcus, a broad-shouldered vampire with silver streaks in his dark hair, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Vivienne, perhaps we should." "Should what?" Vivienne interrupted, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Pretend that we don't all know the truth, that our mighty vampire king married someone completely beneath his station." She took a sip of her wine, savoring both the taste and the shocked expressions around her. "I mean, really, from what I understand, she's utterly plain. Mousy brown hair, unremarkable features, and apparently she dresses like a provincial merchant's daughter. Can you imagine?" "The king must have had his reasons," offered Lady Caroline weakly, though her eyes betrayed her own curiosity. Vivienne laughed, a sound like tinkling bells that drew even more attention to their group. "Oh, I'm sure he did. Perhaps she has some hidden talent we don't know about, though honestly with her looks she'd need quite a few talents to compensate." The circle around her had grown larger now, other nobles drawn by the scandalous nature of the conversation. Some looked uncomfortable, but others leaned in eagerly, hungry for gossip. "I heard," Vivienne continued, warming to her subject, "that she rarely appears at court functions. The king keeps her hidden away, probably embarrassed to be seen with her. Can you blame him? Imagine being the most powerful being in the realm and having to present that as your queen." "Lady Vivienne," Lord Marcus tried again, his voice low and urgent, "you're being reckless. If anyone reports this to—" "To whom?" Vivienne spun to face him, her eyes flashing. "I'm merely stating facts. Everyone here knows them. The Queen is plain, unremarkable, and frankly an embarrassment to the throne. Why should we all pretend otherwise?" She turned back to the crowd, which had now swelled to at least 30 nobles, all watching her with varying degrees of shock, amusement, and horror. "In fact, I'll say it plainly, I cannot understand what the king sees in her. Any woman in this room would make a better queen, myself included." A collective gasp rippled through the group. This was no longer mere gossip, it was open criticism of the monarchy itself. "Think about it," Vivienne pressed on, emboldened by the wine and the attention. "Our kingdom deserves a queen who embodies beauty, grace, and power, someone who can stand beside the king and complement his magnificence, not some timid, homely creature who hides in the shadows." "I heard she's quite kind," ventured a young vampire maiden near the back of the crowd. Vivienne rolled her eyes dramatically. "Kindness, how utterly pedestrian. Is that really the best we can hope for in a queen? Kindness? Our enemies must laugh at us behind closed doors. The mighty vampire king, ruler of the eternal night, married to someone whose only notable quality is being quite kind." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't help but listen. Vivienne had always had this effect on people. Her charisma was nearly as powerful as her beauty. "And her fashion sense," Vivienne continued, shaking her head in mock dismay. "Or rather, her complete lack of it. I've heard from reliable sources that she prefers simple dresses in muted colors. greys and browns if you can believe it. For a queen, she could wear the finest silks and jewels in the realm, and instead she chooses to look like a serving girl. Lady Caroline, despite her earlier hesitation, couldn't help but add, "I heard she cut her hair short last year. Very unfashionable." Exactly, Vivienne seized on this detail triumphantly. She doesn't even try. That's what bothers me most. If you're going to be queen, at least make an effort to look the part. But no, she's content to be mediocre in every way. An elderly vampire lord at the edge of the crowd finally spoke up, his voice grave. "You play a dangerous game, Lady Vivienne. The king is fiercely protective of his wife." Vivienne waved her hand dismissively. "The king is powerful and wise. Surely he can handle a little honest observation. Besides, I'm not saying anything that isn't true. Has anyone here actually seen her and thought, yes, she's exactly the kind of woman who should sit on the throne beside our magnificent king?" The silence that followed was answer enough for Vivienne. She smiled triumphantly. "I thought not. Look, I understand that the king's personal life is his own business. But when it affects the entire kingdom, when we have to watch our allies whisper and laugh about our plain, unremarkable queen, then it becomes all of our business." She straightened her shoulders, projecting an image of righteous conviction. "Someone needs to say what we're all thinking. Why should we pretend that the queen is something she's not? She's not beautiful, she's not fashionable, she's not inspiring, she's just there." "And what would you have us do?" asked Lord Marcus quietly. "Stage a rebellion based on the queen's appearance?" "Of course not," Vivienne replied smoothly. "I'm simply saying that we shouldn't have to pretend. We shouldn't have to act like she's some great beauty or some inspiring figure when she's clearly neither. Honesty shouldn't be treasonous." At that moment, a ripple of energy passed through the ballroom. The massive double doors at the far end began to open, and a hush fell over the entire gathering. The musicians stopped playing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the entrance. "Their Majesties," announced the herald in a booming voice, "the vampire king and queen." Vivienne felt her heart quicken slightly, but she maintained her composed expression. Finally, she would see this unremarkable woman for herself. Perhaps the reality would even exceed her expectations of mediocrity. The king entered first, as tradition dictated. He was magnificent as always, tall and commanding, with silver hair that flowed past his shoulders and eyes that glowed like molten gold. His presence alone was enough to make even the oldest vampires feel like insignificant children. He wore black and silver, his crown a simple circlet that somehow made him look more powerful than any elaborate headpiece could. Behind him, obscured by his imposing figure, came the queen. Vivienne leaned forward slightly, eager to confirm everything she'd been saying. Around her, the crowd did the same, a collective anticipation filling the air. And then the queen stepped into full view. Vivienne's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent ballroom. Her mouth fell open, and she felt the colour, what little vampires had, drain from her face. The queen wore a gown of royal red, the colour of fresh blood in moonlight. It was a masterpiece of design, fitted perfectly to her figure, with intricate embroidery in gold thread depicting ancient symbols of power. The neckline was modest but elegant, and the sleeves flowed like liquid silk. But it wasn't the dress that stole every breath in the room. It was her. The queen was radiant. Her hair, far from being mousy brown, was a rich chestnut that caught the light and seemed to shimmer with inner fire. Her eyes were a striking amber that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and a graceful neck. She moved with a natural elegance that made Vivienne's practiced glide seem artificial by comparison. But there was something more, something that went beyond mere physical beauty. The queen radiated a presence, an aura of quiet power that filled the room. She didn't demand attention, she simply commanded it naturally, effortlessly. As the royal couple descended the grand staircase, every noble in the ballroom bowed or curtsied deeply. Vivienne, still frozen in shock, was a beat late in her own curtsy. The queen's eyes swept across the crowd, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, they locked with Vivienne's. In that instant, Vivienne felt something that she hadn't experienced in 3 centuries, genuine fear. The queen knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew everything that had been said, The orchestra resumed playing, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around the ballroom like silk. The Vampire King led his queen to the throne dais, where two elaborate chairs sat side by side, both carved from black marble and inlaid with rubies that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Vivienne remained rooted to her spot, her mind racing. Around her, the nobles who had been so eager to hear her gossip moments ago were suddenly very interested in examining the floor, the ceiling, anything but her face. Lady Caroline had actually taken several steps away, as if physical distance could separate her from the scandal. "Are you all right, Lady Vivienne?" Lord Marcus asked quietly, though his tone carried a note of satisfaction. He had warned her after all. Vivienne couldn't answer. She was still staring at the Queen, trying to reconcile the vision before her with everything she had said, everything she had believed. This woman was nothing like the descriptions she'd received. Who had lied to her, and more importantly, why? The King raised his hand, and the music stopped again. His voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the vast ballroom with preternatural clarity. "My beloved subjects," he began, his golden eyes sweeping across the crowd. 500 years ago I took the throne of this eternal kingdom. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have witnessed the birth of stars and the death of worlds. But in all that time, nothing has brought me more joy than this moment here with all of you, celebrating with my queen by my side." He turned to his wife, and the look that passed between them was so intimate, so full of genuine love, that Vivienne felt something twist painfully in her chest. "My queen," the King continued, "has been the subject of much discussion tonight." Vivienne's blood ran cold. Several nobles near her actually gasped and took steps backward, as if she might suddenly burst into flames. "I am aware," the King said, and now there was an edge to his voice sharp as a blade, "that there are those who question her worthiness to sit beside me, those who find her lacking." The Queen placed her hand gently on her husband's arm, and he paused, looking down at her. She smiled at him, a small, private smile, and shook her head slightly. The King's expression softened immediately. "However," he said, his tone warming, "my queen has asked for the opportunity to address such concerns herself, and as always I defer to her wisdom." The Queen rose from her throne, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. She descended the dais with a grace that made the movement look like a dance, her red gown flowing behind her like spilled wine. "Thank you, my love," she said to the King, her voice clear and melodious. It was the first time most of those gathered had ever heard her speak, and the sound was captivating, neither too soft nor too loud, but perfectly pitched to convey both warmth and authority. She turned to face the assembled nobles, her amber eyes scanning the crowd. When they landed on Vivienne, they held no anger, no malice, only a deep, thoughtful consideration that somehow made Vivienne feel even worse than fury would have. "I know what many of you think of me," the Queen began, and several nobles shifted uncomfortably. "I know the whispers that follow me through these halls, that I am plain, that I am unworthy, that I hide away because I am ashamed of my appearance or my station." Vivienne wanted to sink into the floor, wanted to disappear, to be anywhere but here, subjected to this calm, measured gaze. "And I understand," the Queen continued, beginning to walk slowly along the front of the crowd, "why you might think such things. After all, I rarely appear at court functions. I dress simply when I do. I don't adorn myself with the jewels and finery that my position would allow." She paused in her walking, standing now just a few feet from where Vivienne stood frozen. "But perhaps," the Queen said softly, "you have mistaken simplicity for weakness, humility for inadequacy, privacy for shame." With a fluid gesture, the Queen raised her hand. The candles throughout the ballroom suddenly flared brighter, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Every vampire present felt it, a surge of power so intense that it made their ancient instincts scream in recognition of a superior predator. "I am the daughter of the first night," the Queen said, and her voice now carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those listening. "My bloodline predates this kingdom by millennia. My mother was the Moonweaver. My father was the Lord of Eternal Twilight. I have walked between worlds, commanded armies of shadow, and held the very fabric of darkness in my hands." The ballroom was utterly silent. Even the King watched his wife with an expression of pride and something else, relief perhaps that she was finally revealing herself. When I married the king, the queen continued, her power still radiating through the room like waves of heat, I made a choice. I chose to set aside the trappings of my power. I chose to live simply, to move quietly, to let my husband's light shine without my shadow overwhelming it. She turned back to face Vivienne directly now, and this time there was steel in her amber eyes. I chose humility. I chose kindness. I chose to use my power to protect rather than to intimidate. But make no mistake, my choice to be gentle should never be mistaken for an inability to be otherwise. With another gesture, the queen's appearance began to shift. Her eyes started to glow with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Her hair lifted slightly, as if moved by an invisible wind, and shadows began to gather around her like a living cloak. The red gown she wore seemed to deepen in colour until it was the exact shade of arterial blood, and the gold embroidery blazed as if lit from within. This, the queen said, and her voice now carried the weight of centuries, is but a fraction of what I am, what I have always been, what I chose to contain for the sake of peace and harmony in this court. She released her power as suddenly as she'd summoned it, and the ballroom returned to normal. The candles dimmed to their previous warm glow, the temperature stabilized, but the impact of what everyone had just witnessed remained, hanging in the air like the echo of thunder. The queen smoothed down her gown, her expression returning to one of gentle composure. I do not blame those who judged me based on appearances. After all, I cultivated those appearances deliberately. But I hope this evening will serve as a reminder that there is often more to a person than what meets the eye. She turned and began walking back toward the dais, then paused and looked over her shoulder at Vivienne specifically. Lady Vivienne Ashford, the queen said, and Vivienne felt her knees nearly buckle at being addressed directly. I believe you had some concerns about my suitability as queen. Every eye in the ballroom turned to Vivienne. She could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of sympathy, schadenfreude, and morbid curiosity. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a response, an apology, anything that might salvage this situation. Vivienne started, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Your Majesty, I spoke out of ignorance. I was wrong. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. The queen tilted her head slightly, studying Vivienne as one might study an interesting insect. You were wrong about what exactly? My appearance, my worthiness, or merely wrong to say such things aloud? The question was a trap, and Vivienne knew it. There was no right answer. All of it, Your Majesty, Vivienne said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Seeing the queen now understanding even a fraction of what she was, Vivienne felt genuinely ashamed. I was wrong about all of it. I judged you without ever having met you based on rumours and appearances. I was petty, cruel, and foolish. The queen regarded her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. An honest answer, I appreciate that. She returned to the dais and sat beside her husband, who took her hand in his and raised it to his lips in a gesture of such tender devotion that it made Vivienne's chest ache. Let us continue the celebration, the queen announced, her voice once again warm and welcoming. This is meant to be a joyous occasion after all. The orchestra began to play again, and slowly, hesitantly, the nobles began to move and converse. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Everywhere Vivienne looked, she saw nobles glancing at the queen with new eyes, with respect, with awe, and in some cases with barely concealed fear. Lady Caroline approached Vivienne cautiously. We should leave, she whispered urgently, before things get worse. But Vivienne shook her head. Leaving now would be seen as cowardice, as running from the consequences of her actions. She had already humiliated herself enough for one evening. No, Vivienne said quietly. I'll stay, it's the least I can do. The evening proceeded with a surreal quality. Nobles came forward to present gifts to the royal couple, to offer toasts and speeches celebrating the king's reign. Through it all, the queen sat with perfect poise, gracious and warm to everyone who approached, as if the dramatic display of power had never happened. But Vivienne noticed something that made her skin prickle with unease. Every so often, the queen's eyes would drift across the ballroom and land on her, not with anger or malice, but with that same thoughtful, considering expression, as if the queen was trying to decide something. As the night wore on, Vivienne found herself increasingly isolated. Nobles who had been her friends and admirers for decades suddenly had pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Her circle of sycophants had evaporated like mist in sunlight. Even Lady Caroline eventually made her excuses and drifted away. For the first time in her long existence, Vivienne understood what it meant to be truly alone in a crowded room. It was near midnight when a servant in royal livery appeared at Vivienne's elbow. She jumped slightly, not having heard his approach. "Lady Vivienne Ashford," the servant asked, though clearly he knew exactly who she was. "Yes," Vivienne's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Her Majesty requests your presence in the rose garden, immediately." Vivienne's blood turned to ice. The rose garden was outside, away from witnesses. Whatever the Queen wanted to say to her or do to her would happen in private. "Of course," Vivienne managed. "Lead the way." The rose garden was aptly named, though the roses that grew there were unlike any found in the mortal world. They bloomed only in moonlight, their petals ranging from deep crimson to midnight black, and they gave off a faint luminescence that made the entire garden glow softly in the darkness. Vivienne followed the servant through winding paths lined with these ethereal flowers, her heart pounding in her chest. The sounds of the celebration faded behind them until there was only the whisper of wind through petals and the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet. They arrived at the heart of the garden, where a fountain carved from white marble depicted two figures intertwined in an eternal embrace. The water that flowed through it was crystal clear, reflecting the stars above like liquid diamonds. The Queen stood beside the fountain, her red gown seeming to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. She had her back to Vivienne, looking up at the stars, and for a moment she seemed very young and very old all at once. The servant bowed and departed silently, leaving Vivienne alone with the woman she had spent the evening mocking. "Your Majesty," Vivienne said, sinking into a deep curtsy, "you wished to see me." "Rise, Lady Vivienne," the Queen said without turning around. "I think we've had enough formality for one evening, don't you?" Vivienne straightened slowly, unsure what to expect. The Queen finally turned to face her, and in the moonlight she looked somehow even more beautiful than she had in the ballroom. But it was a terrible beauty, ancient and powerful, and Vivienne had to resist the urge to take a step backward. "Do you know why I asked you here?" the Queen asked. To punish me for my words, I assume," Vivienne answered honestly. "I deserve whatever judgment you see fit." Full story is on my website, link in description. It's completely free, no sign-up required. Go and watch the complete ending.